They treated Olivia Bennet like she was invisible, just another intern hired to fetch coffee and organize spreadsheets, but inside that glass tower in downtown Chicago, surrounded by polished marble floors and million-dollar egos, she was the only person who could stop the company from collapsing. The disaster began at 8:17 on a rainy Thursday morning when the giant presentation screen inside Loudest Technologies suddenly flashed red during a live investor call. Senior executives froze mid-sentence. Error messages spread across the dashboard like cracks across shattered glass. One investor muted his microphone while another cursed under his breath. $12 million in contracts hung in the balance, and every second the system stayed offline pushed the company closer to humiliation. Inside the conference room, panic spread faster than logic. What the hell is happening? CEO Leonard Graves barked, slamming his hand against the glossy black table as executives scrambled through laptops and whispered excuses. The room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and stress. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, thunder rolled over the Chicago skyline while employees rushed through the hallways clutching tablets and phones. And in the middle of all that chaos stood Olivia Bennet, holding a cardboard tray with 4 coffees no one remembered asking for. At 26 years old, Olivia looked nothing like the engineers surrounding her. Her light brown hair was tied into a simple low ponytail, and her gray cardigan hung loosely over a white blouse she'd ironed herself that morning in her tiny studio apartment 30 minutes outside the city. While the senior staff wore expensive watches and tailored suits, Olivia carried a notebook filled with handwritten system diagrams no one had ever bothered reading. Intern, Victor Langford snapped without even looking at her. Set those down and stay out of the way. His sharp voice cut through the room like a blade. Victor was Novarris's lead systems director, a man known for humiliating junior employees just to remind everyone who held power. Tall, polished, and endlessly arrogant, he carried himself like the company belonged to him. Olivia quietly placed the coffees on the table while conversations exploded around her. The investors are threatening to pull out, one executive whispered. We can't even access the backup servers, another muttered. Victor rubbed his forehead aggressively before pointing toward the screen. Who approved this deployment? No one answered. The silence grew heavier. Then his eyes landed briefly on Olivia standing near the door. Why are you still here? He asked coldly. A few nervous chuckles echoed around the room. Olivia lowered her eyes slightly. I think the backup pipeline rerouted incorrectly during last night's update, she said carefully. Victor stared at her for a second before laughing under his breath. That's adorable, he replied. The intern thinks she understands enterprise infrastructure. A couple of engineers smirked while others avoided eye contact entirely. Olivia nodded once and stepped back toward the hallway without another word. But as the conference room descended deeper into panic, none of them noticed the quiet look in her eyes. Because while the loudest people in that building fought to protect their reputations, the one person they ignored had already begun figuring out exactly how to save them all. Olivia walked quickly through the buzzing hallway while alarms from the failed servers continued echoing faintly through the upper floors of Loudest Technologies. Employees rushed past her carrying laptops and charging cables, their polished shoes striking sharply against the marble floors. Nobody looked at her twice. That was normal. For the past 6 months, Olivia Bennet had existed inside the company like a shadow moving quietly between departments while louder people took credit for work they barely understood. Her intern badge hung from a thin blue lanyard around her neck, slightly bent at the corners from long overnight shifts nobody knew she worked. She reached the smaller operations room near the back of the engineering floor and gently closed the door behind her. Unlike the executive conference room upstairs filled with expensive cologne and rehearsed confidence, this room smelled of overheated hardware and stale coffee. Rows of monitors flashed warning signals across the darkened walls while cooling fans hummed constantly in the background. Olivia slowly set her notebook on the desk and stared at the system logs streaming across the screen. Her calm expression never changed, but her eyes moved rapidly, scanning line after line of corrupted processes. Outside the room, Victor Langford continued tearing through his engineering team. "I want answers now," his voice thundered through the hallway. "If this launch fails, every single one of you can start updating your resumes." The fear spreading through the company had become almost physical. A major investor meeting was scheduled to begin in less than 40 minutes, and the artificial intelligence platform Novaris had spent nearly 2 years building was collapsing in real time. Millions of dollars. Hundreds of jobs. Entire careers balanced on a system no one could stabilize. Olivia quietly opened another terminal window and frowned. The issue was worse than they realized. Last night's software update had triggered a hidden routing conflict between the backup servers and the live infrastructure. Instead of isolating corrupted traffic, the system had begun feeding broken data back into itself like a machine drowning in its own reflection. Any rushed fix would destroy the remaining recovery points completely. She exhaled slowly. Then she noticed something else. A timestamp. Her fingers froze above the keyboard. Someone had manually overridden the safety protocols at 1:13 that morning. Olivia leaned closer to the screen, the glow of the monitor reflecting softly in her blue eyes. There it was. Victor Langford's administrator credentials. The room went silent except for the low mechanical hum of servers fighting to stay alive. Olivia remembered the warning she had tried to send 3 weeks earlier after noticing instability in the deployment pipeline. She had emailed a detailed report directly to Victor. He never responded. The next morning her recommendations disappeared from the internal documentation completely. At the time she told herself it did not matter. Interns were expected to stay quiet. Interns were expected to learn their place. Upstairs, the panic only worsened. Investors had started demanding explanations while legal teams prepared emergency statements in case the launch collapsed publicly. One senior engineer stormed out of the conference room muttering, "We are done." Another simply sat with his face buried in his hands. Then Leonard Graves stepped into the engineering floor himself. The 60-year-old CEO looked nothing like the composed executive seen in magazine interviews. His tie hung loose around his collar and exhaustion darkened the lines beneath his eyes. "Somebody tell me we still have options," he demanded. Nobody answered. The silence felt suffocating. Then from the back operations room, barely louder than the hum of the servers themselves, Olivia Bennett quietly said, "I think I know what caused it." The engineering floor became unnaturally quiet after Olivia spoke. For a brief moment, even the constant clicking of keyboards seemed to disappear beneath the low mechanical hum of the struggling servers. Leonard Graves slowly turned toward her, his exhausted eyes narrowing with cautious attention. Across the room, several senior engineers exchanged confused glances while Victor Langford stared at Olivia as though she had interrupted something sacred. "You?" Victor said sharply, letting out a humorless laugh. "This is exactly why interns are not supposed to wander into engineering operations during a crisis." A few nervous smiles appeared around the room, but nobody fully committed to laughing this time. The tension hanging over the company had become too heavy for fake confidence. Olivia remained calm beside the monitor, her cardigan sleeves slightly rolled back as streams of system logs reflected across her face. "The corruption started after the backup reroute override," she explained carefully. "The live environment began feeding damaged cache data back into the primary cluster." Victor crossed his arms immediately. "That is impossible," he snapped. "Those safeguards cannot be bypassed manually." Olivia hesitated only slightly before turning the monitor toward Leonard Graves. They already were. The CEO stepped closer while several engineers moved behind him. On the screen sat the administrator override log stamped with Victor Langford's credentials. The room fell completely silent. Victor's confident posture stiffened almost instantly. "That does not prove anything," he said quickly. "My credentials are used across multiple deployment systems." But Olivia quietly shook her head. Not for direct authorization changes at 1:13 in the morning. Nobody spoke. One engineer slowly removed his glasses while another stared at the floor. The atmosphere inside the room shifted in a way Victor could feel immediately. For the first time all morning, people stopped looking at him for answers. Leonard Graves studied the screen carefully, his jaw tightening. "Victor," he said slowly, "did you manually force the deployment?" Victor stepped forward defensively. "We were behind schedule. Investors were demanding progress updates. I accelerated the rollout to avoid delays." "Without stability testing?" one engineer asked under his breath. Victor ignored him completely. "The issue right now is fixing the system," he replied coldly. "Not interrogating leadership decisions." Olivia looked back toward the monitor, her voice remaining almost painfully calm compared to the panic surrounding her. "The backups are still recoverable if we isolate the corrupted nodes before synchronization completes." Victor scoffed immediately. "And how exactly would an intern know that?" She did not answer right away. Instead, she opened another diagnostics window and typed several commands with quiet precision. Seconds later, the system map appeared across the screen, exposing the exact chain reaction spreading through the infrastructure. Several engineers leaned closer unconsciously. One of them whispered, "She mapped the entire network architecture." Another quietly added, "That should take hours." Victor's face darkened. "You had no authorization to access these systems," he said firmly. Olivia finally looked up at him directly. "You asked me to monitor deployment logs every night for the past 3 months, she replied softly. "Because nobody else wanted the overnight shifts." The words landed harder than anyone expected. Leonard Graves slowly turned toward Victor again, realization beginning to settle across his face. While executives attended networking dinners and senior engineers went home before sunset, the quiet intern everyone ignored had spent months inside these systems learning every weakness they had overlooked. Rain continued striking the massive windows overlooking Chicago while the digital countdown clock in the conference room dropped below 20 minutes before the investor presentation resumed. Then one of the primary servers suddenly failed completely. Red warning lights flashed across every monitor. A voice from the operations desk shouted, "We are losing the final recovery cluster." Panic surged again. Victor cursed under his breath while engineers scrambled in every direction. But Olivia Bennett simply stared at the collapsing system with steady eyes, already knowing exactly what had to happen next. Red warning symbols flooded the operations room as another server cluster disappeared from the network map. A harsh alarm echoed across the engineering floor while employees rushed between desks with growing desperation. The massive digital clock mounted above the conference room entrance now showed 17 minutes until the investor presentation resumed. Every person inside Novaris Technologies could feel the company slipping closer to disaster. Leonard Graves stared at the collapsing dashboards with the exhausted expression of a man watching years of work crumble in real time. "Can anyone stabilize the system?" he demanded. Nobody answered immediately. Senior engineers avoided eye contact while others continued typing furiously without confidence. Then Olivia Bennett stepped closer to the primary console. "I can stop the corruption spread," she said quietly. Victor Langford let out a sharp breath through his nose. "Absolutely not." His voice cut through the room instantly. "We are not handing a $12 million infrastructure crisis to an intern." Olivia remained calm despite every eye suddenly turning toward her. "If we isolate the synchronization chain before the next cascade hits, the backup cluster can still recover." Victor shook his head aggressively. "You do not understand the scale of this system." One engineer near the back of the room slowly muttered, "Actually, I think she does." Victor turned toward him immediately. "Excuse me?" But before the engineer could answer, another critical alert exploded across the monitors. This time several investor dashboards went completely dark. Panic erupted again. Phones started ringing throughout the floor while someone from legal shouted that one of the investors was threatening to terminate negotiations entirely. The room spiraled into noise and confusion. Through all of it, Olivia stood perfectly still beside the console, her eyes fixed on the data streams moving across the screens. Leonard Graves looked between Victor and Olivia, weighing panic against instinct. "How long?" he asked quietly. Olivia answered immediately. "If I can access the root deployment layer right now, I may be able to stabilize the live environment within 10 minutes. Victor laughed in disbelief. "Maybe," he snapped. "This is not some college coding exercise." He stepped closer toward Leonard Graves. "If she touches the infrastructure and makes things worse, the company is finished." Olivia finally looked directly at Victor again. Her voice stayed calm, but there was something unshakably steady underneath it now. "It is already getting worse." The room fell silent. Rain hammered against the towering windows overlooking downtown Chicago while the servers emitted a strange mechanical hum that sounded almost alive. Leonard Graves slowly exhaled and loosened his tie further. "What do you need?" he asked her. Victor froze. "Leonard," he warned sharply, "you cannot seriously be considering this." But the CEO never looked away from Olivia. "Tell me what you need." Olivia glanced back toward the system map. "I need unrestricted access to the deployment core. I need everyone to stop forcing manual resets. And I need complete silence for 10 minutes. Several engineers exchanged stunned looks. Nobody spoke to leadership like that inside Novaris. Especially not an intern. Victor's face hardened with disbelief. "You are out of your mind," he said coldly. "Do you have any idea what happens if she fails?" Leonard Graves slowly turned toward him. "Do you?" he replied. Victor opened his mouth but said nothing. The silence that followed felt heavier than the storm outside. Then Leonard reached for the executive authentication tablet resting on the desk. With a single motion, he transferred root system authority directly to Olivia Bennett. The notification flashed across every engineering monitor in the room. A hush fell instantly. Some employees looked shocked. Others looked relieved. Victor simply stared at the screen as though the company itself had betrayed him. Olivia carefully sat down at the primary console while rows of monitors illuminated her face in pale blue light. Then, without another word, her fingers touched the keyboard and the entire room stopped breathing. The entire engineering floor watched in complete silence as Olivia Bennett began working. The glow from 6 different monitors reflected across her calm face while lines of diagnostic data streamed endlessly through the darkened operations room. Outside, thunder rolled over downtown Chicago, shaking the massive glass windows surrounding Novaris Technologies. Inside, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the executives who normally dominated every room now stood quietly behind her chair, afraid to interrupt whatever fragile chance remained. The digital countdown clock above the conference room door dropped to 14 minutes. Olivia's fingers moved steadily across the keyboard with a level of precision that no one expected from someone they had spent months dismissing as invisible. She opened layer after layer of deployment architecture without hesitation, navigating the infrastructure faster than the senior engineers responsible for building it. "How is she doing that so quickly?" one analyst whispered. Another engineer stared at the monitor in disbelief. "She memorized the entire system tree." Victor Langford's jaw tightened harder with every passing second. He remained near the back of the room with his arms crossed, trying desperately to maintain authority while the company slowly shifted away from him. "Speed means nothing if she breaks the live environment permanently," he said coldly. But nobody responded this time. Olivia isolated the corrupted synchronization loop and opened the backup cluster logs. The deeper she searched, the clearer the truth became. Weeks of instability warnings had been ignored. Temporary patches had been layered over deeper structural failures simply to keep investor deadlines intact. And every override led back to Victor. Leonard Graves watched quietly from behind her shoulder, the weight of realization growing heavier across his tired face. "Can it be saved?" he finally asked. Olivia paused briefly before answering. "Yes," she said softly. "But only if we stop pretending the original deployment was stable." The room went still again. Those words landed harder than accusations. Because everyone inside Novaris understood exactly what she meant. For months, the company had prioritized appearances over reality. Investor confidence over engineering integrity. Short-term praise over long-term stability. And now the truth was collapsing across every screen in the building. Another warning alert flashed red. The recovery cluster had less than 8 minutes before total synchronization failure. One of the executives muttered quietly, "If that cluster goes down, the investors walk." Olivia did not react emotionally. She simply continued working with steady focus while rows of command windows expanded across the monitors like puzzle pieces finally falling into place. Then suddenly she stopped typing. The room froze instantly. Victor stepped forward first. "What happened?" Olivia stared silently at the screen for several seconds. Then she slowly opened a hidden development archive buried deep inside the deployment logs. Hundreds of undocumented stabilization patches appeared instantly. Timestamps. Recovery protocols. Emergency reroutes. Quiet fixes written over the course of 6 months. One engineer leaned closer and his eyes widened. These patches kept the system alive during every stress test. Another whispered, "Who wrote them?" Olivia remained quiet. Leonard Graves looked directly at the author credentials displayed beside every patch entry. Olivia Bennett. A hush fell across the room. Victor's expression changed completely. Confusion turned into disbelief. "That is impossible," he said under his breath. But the evidence covered every screen around him. The intern he mocked for months had secretly prevented catastrophic failures again and again while leadership took public credit for stability they did not understand. Leonard Graves slowly looked at Olivia. "You built these recovery systems yourself?" Olivia nodded once without turning away from the monitors. "I noticed the infrastructure problems during my first month here," she explained quietly. "Nobody responded to the reports, so I fixed what I could after hours." Several employees lowered their eyes in shame. Victor stood completely speechless now, his authority evaporating beneath the cold glow of the monitors. Then another alarm suddenly erupted through the operations room. The final recovery cluster had begun failing faster than expected. The countdown clock dropped below 6 minutes. And for the first time that morning, fear finally appeared in Olivia Bennett's eyes. The operations room descended into complete silence except for the sharp pulse of warning alarms echoing from the failing servers. Red notifications flashed across every monitor while the digital countdown clock above the conference room dropped below 5 minutes. Outside the glass walls overlooking downtown Chicago, storm clouds darkened the skyline, casting the entire engineering floor in a cold gray light. Olivia Bennett stared at the collapsing recovery cluster without blinking. For the first time all morning, uncertainty touched her expression. Not because she did not understand the system, but because she knew exactly how little time remained. Leonard Graves noticed it immediately. "Tell me what you need," he said quietly. Olivia inhaled slowly, her eyes fixed on the network map spreading across the monitors. The corruption is moving faster now because the synchronization loop duplicated itself after the override. Several engineers exchanged confused looks. One finally admitted under his breath, "I did not even know that was possible." Olivia continued typing while lines of code scrolled rapidly down the screen. "If I isolate the final cluster manually, the live environment might survive long enough to stabilize." Victor Langford immediately stepped forward again. "Might," he repeated sharply. "You are gambling with the entire company." Olivia looked up at him calmly. "The gamble happened last night when you forced the deployment." The room went dead silent. Victor froze mid-sentence while several executives slowly looked away from him. Leonard Graves lowered his eyes briefly, absorbing the full weight of what had happened under his leadership. Then another engineer suddenly shouted from the far side of the room. Investor access portals are failing again. Panic surged instantly. Phones began vibrating across desks while emergency messages flooded employee screens. One executive whispered, "If the investors lose access during the presentation, we are finished." Olivia glanced toward the clock. 4 minutes. She closed her eyes for one brief second, centering herself against the pressure crushing everyone around her. Then her fingers moved again, faster than before. The monitors reflected endless streams of commands across her pale blue eyes while the room watched in stunned silence. Every keystroke carried impossible precision. One engineer quietly muttered, "She is rebuilding the routing tree manually." Another whispered, "Nobody does that under live conditions." Victor stood motionless now, his authority completely stripped away by the quiet intern he once dismissed as irrelevant. Olivia opened the final corrupted cluster and began rerouting damaged traffic node by node. Sweat formed lightly across her forehead while the massive server room behind the glass walls emitted a strained mechanical roar. The countdown clock dropped below 3 minutes. Then suddenly the largest monitor in the room went black. A collective gasp spread across the operations floor. Someone cursed quietly while another executive buried his face in his hands. Victor shook his head slowly as if preparing for inevitable failure. But Olivia did not panic. She leaned closer toward the screen, studying the darkness for half a second before opening an isolated emergency shell hidden beneath the failed interface. Her voice remained calm. "The visual dashboard crashed," she said softly. "The infrastructure is still alive." Several engineers stared at her in disbelief. She continued typing with steady focus while everyone else simply watched. Then one by one, tiny green indicators began reappearing across the network map. A server node stabilized. Then another. Then another. The operations room became so quiet that the distant rumble of thunder outside sounded deafening. Leonard Graves slowly stepped closer to the monitor as more systems flickered back online. One engineer whispered, almost afraid to speak too loudly, "She is bringing it back." Victor's face drained of color as the investor access portal suddenly reconnected itself across every screen. The red warning symbols vanished one by one. Then the primary dashboard illuminated fully for the first time all morning. Clean. Stable. Alive. And in that moment, surrounded by silent executives and glowing monitors, Olivia Bennett quietly reached for the keyboard again because she knew the hardest part still was not over. The operations room remained frozen in stunned silence as the primary dashboard stabilized across every monitor. Green system indicators replaced the sea of flashing red warnings that had consumed the building only minutes earlier. The investor access portals reconnected one by one while data streams resumed flowing smoothly through the network architecture. For the first time that morning, the strained mechanical hum of the servers sounded steady again instead of desperate. Nobody inside Novaris Technologies seemed able to process what they were witnessing. Olivia Bennett sat quietly at the primary console, her fingers still moving across the keyboard with calm precision while executives and engineers stared at her as though they were seeing her for the first time. The countdown clock above the conference room entrance dropped below 90 seconds. Leonard Graves slowly straightened his posture, unable to take his eyes off the restored infrastructure map glowing across the monitors. "System stability?" he asked carefully. A senior engineer hurried toward the analytics station and checked the incoming reports twice before answering. 97% stabilized and climbing. His voice cracked slightly from disbelief. Another analyst turned from her monitor with wide eyes. "Investor dashboards are fully operational again." A wave of stunned murmurs spread quietly through the operations floor. Some employees sat down heavily in their chairs while others simply stared at Olivia in silence. Victor Langford remained near the back of the room, motionless beneath the cold overhead lighting. The confidence that once surrounded him had completely vanished. He watched the system recover through processes he barely understood while the intern he mocked rebuilt the company in front of him. Then the conference room screens suddenly illuminated with incoming investor connections. Faces from New York, San Francisco, and London appeared across the massive displays. Multi-million-dollar stakeholders adjusted their cameras while waiting for explanations about the catastrophic outage they had just witnessed. Leonard Graves glanced toward the room, then back at Olivia. "Can we survive the presentation?" he asked quietly. Olivia studied the final diagnostics for one last moment before nodding once. "Yes," she answered softly. "But the system still needs manual supervision for the next few hours." Leonard Graves looked around the room slowly. "Then let us begin." The executive team moved toward the conference room almost automatically, still processing the impossible reversal that had just unfolded. But before Leonard stepped away, he paused beside Olivia's chair. "You are coming with us," he said firmly. Olivia looked genuinely surprised for the first time all morning. "Me? You kept this company alive," Leonard replied. "You belong in that room more than most people already sitting at that table." The room went silent again. Several engineers lowered their eyes while others exchanged uncomfortable glances, remembering every joke, every dismissal, every time they treated Olivia like background noise. Victor finally stepped forward, forcing tension into his voice. "Leonard, investors do not want technical confusion during a crisis presentation." Leonard slowly turned toward him. "No," he replied calmly. "They want competence." Victor froze mid-breath. Nobody defended him this time. Olivia stood quietly from the console, smoothing the sleeves of her gray cardigan as glowing monitors reflected behind her like silent witnesses. She looked nothing like the polished executives surrounding her. No expensive jewelry. No tailored suit. No rehearsed corporate confidence. Yet somehow she carried more calm authority than anyone else in the building. As the executive team entered the massive glass conference room, conversations immediately stopped among the investors on screen. Their expressions shifted from frustration to confusion as they noticed the young intern walking beside the CEO himself. Olivia took a seat quietly near the end of the long black table while rain continued sliding down the windows behind the Chicago skyline. Leonard Graves looked around the room once before speaking. "Before we continue this presentation," he said carefully, "there is someone you all need to meet." And at that exact moment, Victor Langford realized the company was no longer looking at Olivia Bennett like an intern at all. The conference room felt completely different now. Less than an hour earlier it had been filled with panic, arrogance, and quiet desperation. Now the massive screens lining the walls displayed stable investor dashboards while rain continued sliding down the windows behind the Chicago skyline. Executives sat straighter in their chairs, relieved to still have a company worth defending. But the real change was not the restored infrastructure. It was the way every person in that room kept looking toward Olivia Bennett. The same intern most of them had ignored for months now sat silently beside the CEO while international investors waited for answers. Leonard Graves folded his hands carefully on the conference table before speaking. "The system disruption this morning was resolved internally before any permanent data loss occurred," he explained calmly. "And the person responsible for stabilizing our infrastructure is sitting in this room." Several investor screens shifted immediately toward Olivia. A man joining remotely from Manhattan adjusted his glasses. "Your lead engineer?" he asked. Leonard paused for a brief moment. "No," he replied quietly. "Our intern." The room went silent. Even through the screens, disbelief was visible. Olivia lowered her eyes slightly, uncomfortable with the sudden attention. She had spent most of her life trying not to stand out. Back in Ohio, where she grew up in a small 2-bedroom house with a single mother working double shifts at a grocery store, invisibility had felt safer than expectations. She remembered studying computer systems late at night beside hospital bills spread across the kitchen table after her mother became sick. Scholarships helped for a while. So did her acceptance into Massachusetts Institute of Technology at 19. But life changed faster than ambition. When medical debt swallowed her family whole, Olivia quietly left school and took contract programming jobs no one else wanted. Overnight server maintenance. Emergency debugging. Infrastructure repair. Work that paid enough to survive but rarely enough to be respected. Leonard Graves looked toward her gently. "Olivia," he said, "would you explain what happened this morning?" Every eye in the room turned toward her again. Victor Langford remained silent near the far end of the conference table, his expression stiff beneath the cold overhead lighting. Olivia hesitated briefly before speaking in her soft, steady voice. "The infrastructure failed because warning systems were ignored in favor of accelerating deployment deadlines," she explained carefully. No emotion. No revenge. Just truth. Several executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Olivia continued calmly. "The backup architecture became unstable weeks ago. Temporary fixes masked the deeper problem until the override caused a full synchronization collapse." One investor frowned slightly. "And you identified this alone?" Olivia nodded once. "I submitted reports multiple times. When they were not reviewed, I created temporary stabilization patches after hours to prevent larger failures." A hush fell across the room. Leonard Graves slowly slid a tablet across the conference table toward the investors. Displayed across the screen were months of undocumented recovery patches, carrying Olivia Bennett's credentials. Quiet work. Invisible work. The kind nobody celebrates because nobody notices it until everything breaks. One investor leaned closer to his camera. "You maintained this infrastructure yourself while working as an intern?" Olivia looked down briefly before answering. "I just did not want the system to fail." Those simple words hit harder than any dramatic speech could have. Victor finally spoke, his voice tight with frustration. "The situation is more complicated than she is presenting." But before he could continue, Leonard Graves interrupted him quietly. "No," he said. "It really is not." The room froze instantly. Leonard turned toward the investors with calm clarity. "This company nearly lost everything today because leadership ignored competence when it came from someone without status." Nobody moved. Nobody argued. Victor stared at the table in front of him while the silence around him grew heavier by the second. And for the first time since entering Novartis Technologies, Olivia Bennett was no longer the invisible person sitting quietly in the corner of the room. By late afternoon, the storm over Chicago had finally begun to fade, leaving long streaks of pale sunlight across the glass towers surrounding Novartis Technologies. Inside the building, however, the atmosphere had changed far more than the weather. The investor presentation ended successfully less than an hour after Olivia Bennett stabilized the infrastructure, and against every expectation that morning, not a single contract had been lost. In fact, several investors extended their commitments after witnessing how quickly the crisis had been contained. But nobody inside the company was celebrating loudly. The energy throughout the executive floor had become quieter. More careful. As if everyone suddenly understood how close arrogance had brought them to destruction. Employees gathered in small groups near the operations center, speaking in hushed voices while glancing occasionally toward Olivia sitting alone beside the restored server monitors. She looked exactly the same as she had that morning. Same gray cardigan. Same notebook filled with handwritten diagrams. Same calm expression. Yet somehow the entire building now moved differently around her. Engineers who barely acknowledged her before now stepped carefully when speaking to her. Executives nodded respectfully when passing by. The invisible intern had become the person everyone could no longer ignore. Inside the executive conference room, Leonard Graves stood near the windows overlooking the city while members of the board quietly reviewed emergency reports from the day's collapse. Victor Langford sat silently at the far end of the table, his shoulders tense beneath the expensive suit that once carried so much authority. Nobody looked toward him anymore when technical questions were discussed. The shift had happened completely. Leonard finally broke the silence. Effective immediately, he said calmly, Victor Langford is being removed from leadership over infrastructure operations pending a full internal review. No one argued. No one even looked surprised. Victor stared down at the table for several seconds before speaking quietly. You are replacing me with an intern? Leonard shook his head slowly. No, he replied. I am replacing you with the person who actually protected this company. The room went silent again. Victor lowered his eyes, unable to respond. Across the hall, Olivia quietly packed her notebook into her bag, preparing to leave like any ordinary employee finishing a long, exhausting day. She never asked for recognition. Never demanded apologies. Never tried humiliating the people who underestimated her. That was what unsettled everyone most. Her dignity remained untouched by power. Leonard stepped out of the conference room and approached her personally. Several employees nearby stopped talking immediately. Olivia, he said gently, before you leave, there is something we need to discuss. She looked up calmly. Leonard handed her a formal document bearing the company seal. The board voted unanimously, he explained. We would like you to lead the new Infrastructure Resilience Division at Novartis Technologies. Olivia blinked once, genuinely stunned for the first time all day. I am still an intern, she said softly. A faint smile crossed Leonard's tired face. Not anymore. A hush fell across the hallway. Employees watched silently as Olivia looked down at the offer letter in her hands. Senior Director of Infrastructure Stability. Full executive authority. Her fingers tightened slightly around the paper, not out of greed or triumph, but disbelief at how quickly life could change when people finally chose to see the truth instead of appearances. Near the back of the hallway, Victor stood quietly alone, watching the moment unfold. Their eyes met briefly. For a second, the arrogant certainty that once defined him disappeared completely. I underestimated you, he admitted quietly. Olivia held his gaze without anger. You underestimated a lot of people, she replied softly. Victor lowered his eyes again. No dramatic revenge. No public humiliation. Just truth delivered with calm dignity. As evening sunlight filled the towering glass corridors of Novartis Technologies, employees slowly stepped aside to let Olivia walk through the hallway. And for the first time since entering that building, nobody called her the intern. Because sometimes the quietest person in the room is not silent because they have nothing to say. Sometimes they are silent because they are carrying the weight that everyone else failed to see. And that day, inside a company built on titles and appearances, people finally remembered what real competence looked like.